Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today. We just have everyone joining the space, so we will get started in just one moment here. All right, I'll go ahead and get started. So, hi, good afternoon, and welcome to our Learning Exchange series today. We're on February 3rd. I'm your host, Lauren Cooper, and I lead the Forest, Carbon, and Climate program at Michigan State University. We've been so pleased to lead this year's Learning Exchange series in partnership with the Forest Climate Working Group. And for those that are not familiar, if you're new to the space or these events, the Forest Climate Working Group is a diverse group of forest interests with, I believe, over 60 members now, including landowner groups, industry actors, conservationist organizations, academia, and those active in carbon markets. The group has worked together for more than a decade to advocate for state and federal policies that work to ensure sustainable forest use and prevention of land use change. So to get to today's speaker, I'd first like to introduce we have two speakers. So I'd like to introduce Christine Cadigan, who's the director of the American Forest Foundation's Family Forest Carbon Program, and Austin Rempel, manager of forest restoration for American Forests. And today they're going to be talking about innovative approaches to increasing carbon on the landscape. So looking at large scale reforestation, large scale incentive initiatives, and particularly a program called the Family Forest Carbon Program through American Forest Foundation. So really looking forward to this solutions-oriented conversation today. But before we get, before I hand it over to our speakers, we're going to cover a couple of housekeeping details. One is that we will be collecting questions throughout the presentations, and we'll have a Q&A at the very end. And so since we have two speakers, we really encourage you to submit questions at any point. And you'll see there's a chat feature on your Zoom interface. So please, any questions that pop up, smaller clarifications, larger questions, feel free to bring them there, and we will monitor them and present them to the speakers at the end. If you'd like to get on our mailing list, please email forestsc@msu.edu to join the email list. And I should also note that you can submit questions there if you are joining by phone, for example, and don't have easy access to the chat interface. And then also for continuing education credits, for those that if this is important to you, we are approved for SAF CFEs and ISA CEUs. If you're interested in SAF credits, those will automatically be communicated to SAF if you've registered with your email address that is associated with your SAF account, that will automatically be applied, but you're welcome to email us as well, or you can contact SAF. For the ISAs, please let us know if you are interested in the credit for this session, and we will communicate that on your behalf. And so with that, and again, reminder, ask questions at any point. And with that, I will hand it over to our speakers. So Austin's going to be speaking first. Will you please take the screen and begin your presentation?
Okay, I had to unmute myself. Can everyone hear me now?
We can hear you, yes.
Awesome, thank you. All right, so thanks everyone for tuning in. I'm Austin Rempel with American Forests. I'm based in southwestern Colorado physically, but in my position, I have the opportunity to be involved with American Forest work across the nation. And I want to present two of our largest scale projects that we think emphasize just what it's going to take to do climate adaptive reforestation at scale. So the first place I want to talk about is the thorn forest ecosystem in the lower Rio Grande Valley, Texas. This one's unique because it's restoring basically an entire ecosystem that spans from northeast Mexico up to southern Texas. And the other example I want to talk about is the 2018 campfire scar, still the deadliest fire in California history, 150,000 acres. And this one illustrates what it takes to do restoration at the scale of a fire scar. But one piece of context here, and you're all very well aware of this. Someone on this call probably wrote this paper, but forests currently and forest products currently capture and sequester 15% of carbon emissions from fossil fuels. That's a huge amount. And we're going to be challenged to keep that level at 15% as climate change heats up over the next decades, centuries, years. So it's going to take these sorts of projects, these large scale ecosystem scale projects, to maintain this carbon sink, and as some are suggesting, double it. So I just also want to outline the principles, what we consider climate resilient reforestation to be. There's a pretty neat little 4-minute read on Medium written by Jad Daly about just what we think these principles are. One, tree species. We need to really pay attention to which species we're using. With all the fundamental changes going on in the climate, trees are changing ranges like crazy. So we need to be diligent about that and use all the tools that are being developed, have already been out there and are coming, to make sure we're making the right choices. Genetics, make sure you're getting the seed from the right places. Can't emphasize that enough. And planting techniques, this one's really code for don't plant and walk away. You need to prep the site and take care of it afterwards. And adaptive management, I kind of roll my eyes because I hear this one so often, but this one really speaks to the need to learn from what we're doing and set them up to be measured. And I've been bad about this, and I can tell you a story about that, but it's increasingly important with the changes and the pace of the change we're seeing. Lastly, I'll just add my own here, and you'll see this throughout the presentation, is how important partnerships are to work at this scale. And information sharing, sort of like what we're doing today. So with that, I want to start the first example, which is thorn forest, the thorn forest ecosystem, also known as thorn scrub, because they are short trees. They're trees, but they're not what many people would identify as a forest. It's a short, dense, scrubby system that runs from Mexico up to southern Texas. And that is one of our planting sites. Right there in the middle is an adult tree, and in the background, but we're trying to plant about 700 trees per acre there. And what's unique about this place is that there are about 55 tree and scrub species that make up this assemblage of shrub. And what we're doing there is reclaiming of marginal abandoned ag lands. So we've done about 4,000 acres so far. We started in 1993, and we're getting pretty good at it. It's taken a while. It's really starting from scratch, but now some of the plots are starting to look like mature forest. So it's a great example of afforestation, and at a fairly large scale, at least for the US, for non-tropical systems. So that the photos here are an abandoned agricultural field, and we're turning that into short thorn scrub there. I do want to stop here and say that this isn't a great carbon project. You know, these are slow growing places. These are dry places, but there are every landscape needs to reach its carbon potential, and there are water benefits. But really why we're doing this is biodiversity. It's one of the biodiversity hotspots in the US. 530 species of bird, butterflies, threatened endangered species, including the ocelot. The ocelot, we do have them in the US, and they're completely dependent on intact forests. And anyone knows what a jaguarundi is, let me know. I don't. And this is the map of where we're working. So if you can see the tiny map in the left-hand corner, it's deep South Texas, right along the border with Mexico. And we planted 2 million trees over the past 22 years, 25, 30 years. And the green spots, the various shades of green, are properties that are being added gradually. Most of them are farm fields that are being added to the refuge system by the Fish and Wildlife Service. These are places where they were abandoned ag lands. They're being leased or bought and turned into thorn scrub. And our intent here, and this sort of gets into the strategy we're following going forward, is to connect all of these pieces together. So the green spots you see on this map are intact thorn forest. And the pink spots in between are where we're restoring to knit them together so that the species can get between these stands. What we're doing on the ground, and what we consider to be climate smart at this stage, is really choosing from those 55 species, the 55 species we can grow in the nurseries that are part of our palette to choose from, which is a lot to choose from. Usually we're used to about 3 species. We're really trying to find the ones that are drought adapted and can live in these early cereal environments, these farm fields, frankly, you can see up in the left. And so we started to shift our species selection towards these drought tolerant species. We're also really building up our seed banks and realizing that good seed years are becoming few and far in between. And so we're building up our seed bank and really focusing on seed collection. Site preparation, again, this seems pretty straightforward, but oftentimes, at least in other landscapes, it's really forgotten, both the pre-prep and the post-planting care. We're starting to use nurse plants and things like that. And lastly, also seems straightforward for some parts of the US, but shelter tubes are a must-have. And we're starting to use them in pretty much all of our arid land plantings, including California and New Mexico as well. So if you're in a drought challenged environment, give shelter tubes give them a try. So again, the importance of partnerships. There are a lot of people involved in the Thorn Forest Conservation Partnership, and that makes sense because it's an entire ecosystem. We've got a federal agency, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and RFCS. We've got state agencies, Texas Parks and Wildlife. We've got multiple educational institutions, and at the heart of it is really the community. I think in the US, this is probably the place with the forest restoration effort with the most community support. Every summer, or every fall, at least in the before times, the entire community gets together and plants trees. There's about 2,000 trees, 2,000 people over the course of 3 days go out and plant tens of thousands of trees. So there's just nothing like it elsewhere. The other example, all the way over in the California foothills, is the 2018 Camp Fire. And this was a large fire, unfortunately overshadowed by this summer's fires, but it was 150,000 acres, the most deadly in California history. And it's an interesting spot to work because it's right at the foothills where conifers are sort of migrating uphill. And there's a question about whether or not forests as we know them can stay in this area. So what are they doing? What are they actually trying in terms of climate adaptation? One is pyrosilvicultural founder stands. And that really comes from the realization that there is no sustainable path forward without prescribed fire, without good fire. And so they want to try and find a way to use both prescribed fire and reforest, replant at the same time. We're also going all in on provenance tests, which is a way to find out which species are most adapted to the site now and in the future. So we're testing new species that haven't grown there, like valley oak. And we're also testing species from, well, actually genotypes from drier places, like downhill or even further south in California. Lastly, there's a new attention on oaks. In the past, just because of what foresters are used to, there was a real focus on conifers, but now we're sort of learning how to use non-timber species like oaks in our prescriptions. And lastly, refugia, the lifeboats on the landscape, just focusing on the top 10 to 20% of the entire landscape where trees will be able to survive in the future. So again, a lot of land, need a lot of partners. We have a state agency, CAL FIRE, who's leading the charge in some ways. Bureau of Land Management, Forest Service, own a lot of land in the Camp Fire. And then there are sort of unique to California organization types that work at the local level, like the Butte County RCD, our Resource Conservation District, and the Fire Safe Council. And it takes everyone working in tandem. Like this year, we're sharing tree coolers and practices that last year led to greater survival. So we're doing it faster than we could have individually. And to speak to the changes that we're seeing in this area, these are results from a bioclimate modeling exercise that we did to see which species want to be at these sites in the future. So in 2030 and 2060, this is the probability that these species will be at the site. And remember, all of these species are currently at the site. So sugar pine is projected to disappear. Either we let it go or we find just the best spots where we think it might be able to survive. And that's really true for all the pines and the conifers. It's really oaks who seem to want to live there. And this is what we're expecting. We're expecting up in the right-hand corner, it to move from California mixed conifer down to something that's normally associated with lower elevations, which is kind of an oak and grapevine system, one that's more adapted to drought and heat. This is a screenshot from the species potential habitat tool, kind of a neat online tool that for various species simplifies all the bioclimate models and across a range of climate scenarios, best to worst case scenario, shows what we can expect for certain species. And that blue dot on the middle of the screen here is our planting site. And this gives a pretty clear indication that Douglas fir across all ranges in the orange areas is going to disappear. And we should probably not be relying on the as the workhorse species it really has been for timber in the past. This is a screenshot from a closely or a cousin to the species potential habitat tool, but it's a seed lot selection tool. So looking out to 2060, where can we find climates that are currently similar to what we expect in the campfire? We're using this for seed collection. Where should we be looking for genotypes and species that can handle the campfire area in the future? In this case, we're looking immediately downhill. The sweet spot seems to be about 1,000 feet downhill. If we can get those species up to our planting sites, the science tells us that they should be well adapted. Also, completely counterintuitively, the California coast, it looks like a great place to check for genotypes and species, which no one would have guessed if not for these programs. And this is a plug for our partners, Bureau of Land Management, and their commitment to learning from all of our trials. This is a big monitoring plot we put in our planting this summer or spring, a long time ago, to learn which of these genotypes, some brought from the California coast, places that you would never think to look, to see how they do and be able to quantitatively compare it. And I say this because it's very easy to throw monitoring by the wayside, especially when your tree planters are running as fast as they do. Taking time to set up monitoring plots is a hassle, but it's already been so worth it to learn what to do next year. And I guess I also want to say that this is happening everywhere. The other day, I took a look at the number of forest climate adaptation projects across the US. The top is the NIAC demonstration site map. Bottom is WCS climate grants. And the bottom right is the adaptive silviculture for climate change sites. So these things are starting to happen everywhere. And if we can get them to scale, I think we have a really good chance of maintaining that 15% and doing a better job increasing it even. As kind of a last plug for something exciting coming up, American Forests, working with the Nature Conservancy and many academics, put together something called the Reforestation Hub. And this is an online tool that you can look at for any geography, be it a state, a county, how much reforestation potential there is in your area and what type, if it's riparian forest, if it's post-fire, just what is your opportunity space. And this is going to be really useful for all these regional efforts we're talking about. So that's coming out. I don't know if it's formally released yet, but I think it's coming out in the next 2 weeks. And to tie in with that, there's also a paper we're excited about, again, with the Nature Conservancy, New Mexico State, Department of Forestry, Wisconsin, and American Forest, a bunch of people working together. We've looked at the entire reforestation pipeline in the US, and we're looking at where there are pinch points that we're going to hit as we scale up these regional landscape scale efforts. So I can share, this is a nice outline of what we mean by reforestation pipeline. The two that are really overlooked and we sort of focused on in this paper is seed collection and nurseries. They are the engines for each of these landscape scale regional efforts. And they've been sort of overlooked. People really want to get trees in the ground, the outplanting stage, but then they forget about to take care of them afterwards. And we also need to be, especially in the context of climate change, paying really close attention to where our seeds come from, where they might be adapted to in the future, and helping out our nurseries. We've realized a number of things that we wouldn't have realized if we hadn't sent out a survey this summer and got hundreds of responses from nurseries. We realized the challenges they're having. One, almost everyone's ready to retire. There isn't a great workforce pipeline here, especially small mom and pop nurseries. There's no one in the queue to take over. So we're expecting to see quite a few nurseries close. Two, there are just a large number of workforce challenges that the nursery sector is facing. They're having trouble finding skilled managers. They're having trouble finding people they can afford and will stay. I also want to highlight seed availability. It doesn't in a national context, isn't a huge factor, but there are certain places, and we break it out by region. There are certain places like the Southwest, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, that just don't have seed to scale up. They can't find the right genotypes, and there aren't seed collectors, people who know how to do that. So we're pretty excited about this study. It will be useful, we hope, and it's coming out on the 22nd, I believe. And with that, thank you. I think I'm right around the right time. And yeah, look forward to your questions after Christine presents.
Thank you very much, Austin. Really interesting. It's great to see all the images and a lot of the on the ground work is a really nice example. So thanks for sharing. We do have some really great questions rolling in, and just to remind everyone that we are going to save questions for our discussion at the end, but thank you very much for submitting the questions that we have. And now we're going to pass it over to Christine and the Family Forest Carbon Program. So Christine, feel free to take it away.
Thanks, Lauren, and thanks, Austin, for getting us warmed up. I am excited to share with you guys an update on the Family Forest Carbon Program, where we are with our program implementation and what some of our plans are in the future. But before I get started, Lauren reminded me that in this increasingly virtual world, it's nice to get to know each other. So I thought I would just introduce myself. Again, I'm Christine Cadigan. I'm the director of the Family Forest Carbon Program at the American Forest Foundation. But I am also a landowner myself. So this is a picture of me and my family on our tree farm where I live and work, of course. And the cool thing about our program, not just at AFF, but also our partnership with the Nature Conservancy, is that a couple of us are actually landowners. So we bring that perspective with us when we grow and develop the program. And so that makes it, certainly means that it's a little bit closer to home, but also makes it more fun at the same time. I know over the past couple of webinars that Lauren and the group have hosted that we've seen this graph quite a few times, and I still think it's important to just share it once again and really contextualize the work and the importance of the work that we're doing. And this is just to illustrate again the importance of natural climate solutions, and particularly forests, and providing climate mitigation options. And Austin just talked about the opportunities with reforestation, and you can see clearly where reforestation sits as a contribution. But there's also significant opportunity within natural forest management, or more commonly improved forest management. I think we're more familiar with that. And that's really right now what the Family Forest Carbon Program has focused on, is opportunities within the improved forest management category. Why family-owned forests? There's more than just some self-interest here, of course, but it's also because family landowners are the largest forest ownership group in the U.S., and they therefore have a tremendous opportunity to provide climate mitigation opportunities to the U.S. and to the world, really. That said, right now, actually, these small family landowners make up less than 1% of forest carbon projects today. And we've identified a couple of significant barriers associated with signing up for these projects. And that's actually what brought the American Forest Foundation and the Nature Conservancy together, was to identify these barriers, design and launch a program that actually created opportunities for these small landowners. Our incredibly ambitious goal collectively, AFF and TNC, is to reach 20% of family-owned forests by the end of the decade. And we think that we can sequester at least another 2 billion tons of additional CO2 through the end of the century. What's important about this goal, however, is we don't see it as something that's just for AFF and TNC to accomplish alone, but something we really want to help kind of catalyze the rest of the community to increase opportunities for family landowners writ large. So we actually see this as a shared goal, and we're excited to kind of provide some additional options and get the momentum running here. I also want to point out that all of the practices that we're promoting through the Family Forest Carbon Program also achieve a number of other sustainable development goals. Some of them, I have some of them up on the screen, but just to illustrate here, these practices enhance forest stewardship. We're providing additional wildlife habitat, clean water, forest health, investing in rural communities. All of these things are co-benefits that we all appreciate and enjoy. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our program and what sort of differentiates us and how we started tackling some of these family forest obstacles. The first is that our program is administered at a landscape scale, and we're asking landowners to implement specific forest practices, forest management activities that have a quantifiable carbon benefit associated with them. So instead of paying landowners for the stocks that they have sequestered, we're actually thinking about this more as a program that promotes specific practices. We're monitoring our practices and the impacts of those practices, again, at this landscape scale. So we could spread what are still very costly monitoring expenses across all participants. And that helps us reduce additional barriers that otherwise prevented small landowners from entering these projects. We're accounting for permanence, again, at the program level. And so what that enables us to do is to provide individual landowners flexibility through contract length. So we're trying to reduce the commitment that any one landowner is making and hopefully be more palatable for their own family planning and other objectives that they might have with their property. But we still, of course, will maintain very durable credits at the program level and are following guidance set forth by Verra's Verified Carbon Standard. We also have tackled additionality and how we measure our baseline in a really cool and innovative way, and I'll get into that. But it brings us confidence that the impact that we're estimating, the impact from these collective participants that we're estimating is actually additional carbon on the landscape. So we're pretty excited about the advances that our science team has made there. A couple of visuals to help talk about, or to help me talk about what the methodology involves. This is, again, taking it to an individual stand level scale, which I think is just easier for us to all visualize. What we're measuring through our methodology is the stock change. So not the stocks, again, but the stock change. And once a landowner implements that management activity, you start to see the delta between the Family Forest Carbon Program enrollee and what's happening on the landscape or the baseline or common forestry practice. So in this case, the carbon benefit isn't accrued until the landowner actually implements the practice, or conversely, or complementary, I should say, the baseline practice diverges from what our Family Forest Carbon Program prescription looks like. And so that's where you can see that over time, that delta increases, but in the beginning, we're actually accruing very little carbon benefit. How we're determining our baseline is, this is the new method that I was just referencing. We're calculating our baseline based on FIA plots. So you can see from this visual, the yellow property in the center of the visual, that's that's a sample Family Forest Carbon Program enrolled property. And the little trees around that are potential FIA plots that we could use to match based on a number of different covariates to match to be similar to the FFCP enrolled property. And we'll actually choose the 10 FIA donor plots that are best matched with our enrolled property and use them to set a baseline. As you guys know, I'm sure, the FIA plots are regularly updated from the U.S. Forest Service. So with every verification cycle, we can actually rerun or upload the new data from these FIA plots and then reestablish our baseline. So our baseline is changing as we're getting this new observed data, which is collected in the field. And so what that means, or what we believe, is that we're actually isolating the true impact of implementing that Family Forest Carbon Program practice and actually being able to quantify that and accounting for some of the noise that might otherwise happen on the landscape. So late last year and into early this year, we launched this program in 16 counties in Pennsylvania, and we really targeted a small launch at the outset just to hone in on the program implementation, address a couple of key variables, make sure that we were actually building a program that was palatable to landowners and that was something that motivated them to enroll. So these are the results that we've experienced thus far in that limited pilot. So far, we have 43 landowners under contract, accounting for almost 6,000 acres. But as you can see, we have a number of other landowners and acres in the pipeline kind of going through the process to enroll in the program. So some have expressed interest, and we're still kind of going through assessing whether or not those landowners are eligible. Others have had visits with forestry professionals, and at that stage is when they have a more in-depth conversation about the opportunity, learn a little bit more about the practice specifications, and also for the forester or forestry professional to assess the eligibility of the actual land. And then we have a number of other landowners who are reviewing the contracts and talking with their family and assessing whether or not it is indeed the right opportunity for them. So this is where we are as of yesterday. I think I pulled these results yesterday, so fairly recent, actually. A couple of landowners I did want to share. I get very motivated hearing about some of the landowners that signed up for our program, so I did want to share a couple of stories. The first is from John and Sylvia Dysard. John and Sylvia are huge fans of wildlife and hunting, and they want to promote a forest that helps them achieve their objectives, which is primarily around promoting wildlife habitat. And they're relatively new landowners and also relatively new retirees. So when John heard about the program, he was actually really excited about the opportunity to receive funding from the Family Forest Carbon Program because upkeep, maintenance, property taxes can all be really expensive, and he was trying to balance that with his retirement. So he sees this program as a way to not have to worry about liquidating his new asset or engaging in forest management practices for revenue that he otherwise wasn't or otherwise wouldn't have helped him achieve his wildlife habitat objectives. Another landowner, actually 3 landowners who collectively own a property in central Pennsylvania. Louise, Margaret, and Regina are all sisters, and they own this property in Pennsylvania that has been in their family for generations. And they've recently, they've had to sell off part of their property and are also struggling with some of the upkeep, maintenance, and property taxes associated with their property. So when they stumbled upon our program, they were also really excited about the opportunity to provide additional revenue streams. And what's cool about these sisters actually is that through the program, we provide technical assistance, of course, so they'll meet with a forestry professional, but we also provide resources for a management plan and other connections to folks in the forestry community. So Louise in particular has really taken to that and has gone from a relatively unengaged landowner as it relates to forest management to somebody who's now enrolled in her state extension program's Master Forester program and is starting to get really engaged in understanding about understanding forest management and forest stewardship. So it's been really exciting to kind of see the journey of her in particular as she owns and manages her forest. I do want to talk a little bit about the financial structure of the program. I mentioned again that our methodology is measuring stock changes, and as a result, we don't actually see a significant carbon benefit until much later in the contract period. And so what that means is we've had to envision a slightly creative business model for our program. And that means that we need to require low-cost capital at the outset, and we're seeking to do that via a loan or a bond at a low coupon, excuse me, at a low coupon rate, because that gives us the financing we need to provide landowners incentives right at the period of contract signing. So right when they're actually ready to implement the practice. We use that capital, pay landowners directly to implement the practice. And then again, eventually through each verification cycle, we are, and I should have mentioned this before when I talked about the methodology, but we're seeking approval for our methodology through VERA's Verified Carbon Standard. So through that process, we would be awarded verified carbon credits that we could then sell on the voluntary carbon market. And it's through the sale of those credits that we would pay back or pay the principal and interest payments from our initial investment. So it's a little bit of a unique structure here that enables us to pay landowners funding right at the outset and then eventually pay back that debt financing through the monetization of the carbon that's generated in the program. One other interesting thing, and I think we've talked about this a little bit on a couple of past webinars, but one of the other things that we're exploring through this business model is this credit enhancement. So of course, investors are looking for some sort of assurance that their principal is protected, if not more. And so we are looking for sources to guarantee our loan and bond and provide that principal protection for investors. So through this project and within the Central Apps business model over the next couple of decades, our goal is to support approximately 5,000 families or close to 600,000 acres. And what that turns out, or what we estimate that to be, is to provide $150 million in incentives and technical assistance directly to landowners. That generates a little bit more than 15 million tons of verified CO2 equivalents, and importantly, I think, particularly for the conservation community, leverages tons of private climate finance for forest stewardship and conservation, which would not have otherwise been invested in these places for this type of work. So we're really excited about the larger conservation benefit associated with the program too. And again, this is just in our Central Appalachian business model, and so we of course hope to replicate this nationally as well. So where we are today, wrapping up the first phase of our pilot actually in the next couple of weeks, and looking forward to the next phase of implementation, continuing to pursue verification under Verra's Verified Carbon Standard, and we anticipate getting final approval on this methodology in the next month or two. That's kind of the timeline we're on for now. Building the next phase of implementation, which we call lovingly our financial pilot, and that's where we're really going to test this business model. So recruit a couple of investors and also a couple of credit buyers in these long-term forward offtake agreements to purchase the credit. We're also thinking about how we can further develop our product and exploring some opportunities with carbon insetting to see if there are some ways that we can offer these benefits in that way as well. And then, of course, as I alluded to earlier, thinking about as we're experiencing some success in the Central Apps, and given that this is an incredibly pressing decade to achieve our climate mitigation goals, we're also looking to new regions and thinking about where some additional opportunities are. And so a good segue there is these are preliminarily some of the regions that we've looked at in the future. There's some immediate opportunities in the Northwest and the upper Midwest, certainly, but we've also talked with some partners in the Southeast and out West as well. So we are definitely looking to expand the program and work with new partners across the country, but of course want to test and make sure the program will be successful by focusing deliberately in the Central App. So I think, of course, want to mention the partners, and not the least of which is our important implementation and foundational partner, the Nature Conservancy, a couple of whom may even be on the webinar today, I'm not sure. But then, of course, some other funders, investors, and implementers, which are important in this work. So with that, Lauren, I think Austin and I might be ready for questions.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. Very interesting. We have a ton of questions. So I'll start kind of feeding them out here to you both. One of the big questions right away was funding for both reforestation and the Family Forest Carbon Program. So I know, Christine, you touched on that, and you touched on financial sponsors really briefly here at the end. Could you each explain the scale of funding and a little bit more about your current funding model, like what the outlook is for that? Maybe I'll start with you, Christine.
Yeah, sure. So as I mentioned before, our funding model, we start by seeking this low cost capital, or this debt financing, basically. And so we've done a lot of investor discovery outreach, kind of understanding a little bit more about what they would look for in investments, and that's kind of what led us to explore these credit enhancement opportunities too, to make sure that we were providing investors that risk assurance for their principal investments. So I don't know if that's quite getting your question, but we've got a number of different potential investors that we've talked to about these opportunities, and are making sure that we're building a program that they would actually want to invest in, because ultimately if we can't get investors, then we have no program. So we tweak our business model regularly based on that feedback. So that's the first piece. And then also I would say we're similarly doing some discovery work with credit buyers too, because we need to monetize the carbon that we're generated, of course, to pay back these investments. And we've heard a lot, and we've heard a lot of good feedback from them, and evolved our program accordingly. Some of the most important things that came up were the need for these credits to be verified, for example. And so that's why we're working with Vera to get our methodology approved. You know, we talked a lot about some of the other co-benefits associated with our with what we offer, and a lot of buyers are interested in supporting family forest owners and supporting family forest owners in their supply sheds, whatever the company might be, for example. So hopefully that answers your question, Lauren.
Yeah, and then maybe just if you could just elaborate on the financials for the landowner as well. So just to kind of clarify, what's their outlook, and how does that generally? I know there's going to be a range of methodologies at some point, but could you just kind of quickly walk through, their outlook, their commitment, their outlook, and when they receive financial benefit?
Yeah, great question. So the methodology that we're getting approved through Vera is practice agnostic, right? So it should enable us to scale nationally. We can build out additional practices and kind of nest them underneath that methodology, which is really cool. Of course, it has to follow the rules and guidelines of that methodology. But the answer to that question, of course, ultimately what incentive payment does a landowner get is directly attributed to the practice that they're signing up for. So for example, we have 2 practices that we're offering in the Central Apps. We have the opportunity to build out several more, certainly, and practices will look different in different regions. But for those 2 practices, the payments per acre range anywhere from, I think that the average on the low end is like $100 an acre over the contract period to $250 an acre over the contract period. And the contract lengths will also vary depending on the practice itself. And that's just a measure of how long it takes to accrue that carbon benefit, such that we can monetize the benefit enough to recoup the costs of the program. And so for one practice, that's a 10-year contract for landowners, and then for the other practice, it's a 20-year contract. So those are some of the specific obligations or considerations that a landowner would look into.
Thanks, that's really helpful. And I know, I'll just mention that I know that you have some pretty useful descriptions on your website that describe the approaches. So if folks are interested in learning more, when we post the recording to this website, we can add some direct links describing those approaches for those that are really looking at a technical overview. So Austin, could you speak to the financials? We got a number of questions about scale of your projects, the financial considerations. And so could you speak to both the scale of the reforestation projects and then kind of the basics of the costs? And then if there's additional costs when thinking about climate, kind of climate smart reforestation, what does that mean? Financially speaking.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thanks for setting up the question that way. That's useful. So in terms of scale, I'll start with the campfire. The burn scar is 155,000 acres, and we are really focused on the acres that won't have any natural regeneration, which is about 30% of the scar. I'm not great at mental math on presentations specifically, but it's about 30% of the scar that we're really looking at, where the trees aren't going to come back without some investment. And then in the lower Rio Grande Valley, we've done 4,000 acres over the past 20 years. And I know that we're aiming, as we scale up, and we've kind of learned how to do this, we're aiming for tens of thousands of more, possibly hundreds of thousands if it takes off. So it's because it is much larger scale. But at the moment, we are focused on those corridors, so it's a smaller number of acres. So that speaks to the scale, I think. And then for funding, let's see. So most of our funding that American Forest brings is from private corporations, individual donors, foundations that are interested in the active tree planting. They've really bought into these specific landscapes. They want to see reforestation happen in the campfire. They want to see the ocelots have connectivity. And let's see. Yeah, and so they're not really paying for individual outcomes. Like these aren't carbon credits. They're paying for the biodiversity benefits. They're paying for the water benefits, all as a package together. And your question about the climate angle of this funding is a good one. We are seeing a really encouraging trend where people are really asking about survival rates and what we can do to increase that. So there are both individuals and forward-looking companies like Salesforce that are willing to pay more to do things like these tree shelters. And I saw a question about what those are. Those are basically just a plastic tube that is biodegradable that shields the seedlings from sunlight and keeps moisture in. We found those have a huge survivability benefit. But in terms of financing, each seedling costs about $1 because they're mass produced. And then the tree shelters cost about $1.50. So we sort of think about it on a per seedling basis or a per acre basis, but caring for them really does cost a lot more. And in the past, we've sort of matched funding with mostly agencies, in this case, Fish and Wildlife Service, and also Forest Service and BLM. And through our powers combined, we're able to make these projects happen. Does that answer some of your questions?
Yeah, I think that was really helpful. Thank you so much. Another question, this is really for you, Austin, kind of some clarification questions. There's a couple questions that have come in about the reforestation practice itself, and how it's handled in different locations. And clearly you've talked about managing for a massive disturbance or responding to a massive disturbance. Do you generally, are you replacing seedlings or seed types and species types that were previously there, or are you actively, you pointed to this map, thinking about adaptation. Are you generally trying to restore, you're actively making this a transition at this point, or are you starting to just bring that planning into your future plantings? Because I know you mentioned that this transition in some places might be coming. Are you actively encouraging that transition at this point?
We definitely are. We're looking about 30 years out, sometimes 10, 10 to 50 to see what should be there. So we're not just out of reflex replacing what was there. Because oftentimes if you look at the climate projections, that just isn't a very, it's not a good idea because those species probably aren't going to be there. But a lot of cases, it's a judgment call. People in California, they don't want to see sugar pine disappear from their yards. It's everyone's favorite tree. Mm-hmm. And you can see the numbers, you can see that 10% likelihood of it being there, but you also don't want to lose it. I'm definitely in that camp. So what we do in that case is try and find sugar pine seed sources that are adapted to drought. So low elevation seed sources. And it's an interesting story because those are the ones that are getting wiped out by fires. We're losing these adapted low elevation genetics to fires increasingly. And they're also, just because they're really stressed, they're not producing cone crops. Mm-hmm. So I guess that's all to say that even though sometimes the prognosis for species isn't great and it doesn't make sense to replace them, we're connected to them. And so we can do our best by finding the individuals that are best adapted and see how they do, just really monitor it to see if there is a hope. And again, finding the best places to plant. If it's in a wet place, like a wet ravine, that's where we want to try it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So thanks for that. So it is interesting that you're both looking at this landscape scale, but the kind of level of detail of what you're looking at is different in some ways. And so Christine, a question for you about this landscape scale approach. And yet you're doing this landscape level accounting, which you did kind of break down this methodology a little bit, but we were hoping that you could define landscape in your current project and how that might change in expanding into other areas. Do you see more like homogeneous landscapes, being able to use the same data over larger areas. How does that work? How do you see that working for your program and for scaling?
Yeah, good question. And I neglected to mention that, but our Central Appalachian landscape is defined by the ecoregion. So it does apply to forests of the same forest type, forest ecosystem dynamics. So that's kind of the underlying data that we use to estimate which practices are going to have an impact. And then ultimately, when we go through the monitoring and verification cycles, we'll actually see what the true impacts are. So our regions, our landscapes are developed based on these ecoregions, the similarity of the forest type.
And then a follow-up question, I know that the idea of additionality is going to be like the core of the methodologies that you have. So that's, how are you measuring or determining that? But could you just speak to that a little bit again, that maybe just describing again this idea of additionality and how your program is addressing this, and particularly as you're waiting to get the certification from Vera.
Yeah, so it's so as I mentioned, how we determine the baseline is basically how we're addressing additionality, right? Determining whether or not the impact of our program is actually producing additional carbon. And so using this FIA method, where we're using donor plots that are matched to the project plot based on their likeness, and we have a number of different covariates that we use to kind of do this matching. We picked the top 10 of those 100 or so plots that have been identified, those that match the best to the project plot, and use that to determine our baseline. And I did see one question, I think, was asking about how we think that addresses some of the noise in the system, and that, or maybe what some examples of the noise in the system would be. And I would just say things like, natural disasters, pest outbreaks, even maybe some forest policy changes that happen in one state over another that might impact the implementation of various forest management practices, or timber markets, for example, how that might impact how people are managing their forests. We should see all of that happen equally in the baseline plots as well as in the project plots. And so we believe that we've truly isolated the impact of implementing the practice in question, because everything is happening to both sets of plots, right? The project plot and the baseline plots at the same time in real time.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think it's useful to kind of go through that a couple of times, because it's just helpful to think through, how are the practices connecting to the carbon benefits. And then that kind of leads to, maybe we have a couple of minutes left and a number of questions, so we will be having to follow up by email. But I thought that maybe we could close with kind of a bigger question about multiple benefits of forests. And so Austin, you don't specifically measure carbon necessarily in your projects. That's not, you're highlighting other benefits. But I was going to kind of see it, kind of put it towards you. Is it possible to have carbon on the horizon with the reforestation projects? Do you see that being part of a funding model at some point? Are there conversations about that? And then on the flip side to Christine, do you see the potential for other co-benefits of forests being included, water provisioning? Are there conversations about that? Because we know there's a lot of benefits, and depending on a priority, there could be carbon's just an opportunity to do funding for a lot of the work, but it's a blend of mitigation and adaptation. So just thought you could both speak to your priorities and how this range of benefits are playing out in your projects. Maybe I'll go to Austin first this time.
Yeah, and I'm sorry to do this, but my internet cut out right at the exact moment when you're asking your question. So I think I'll answer the question broadly. It's about co-benefits and whether or not we measure them, right?
Yeah, and just
Yeah.
how, carbon is upfront in Christine's project, but there's a lot of other benefits to that work. You are not currently prioritizing carbon, and you mentioned a lot of work about a lot of emphasis on habitat connectivity, but carbon could, we're wondering if carbon could be a part of your funding model or a more dominant benefit depending on perhaps who's funding the project. So just wanted to see how does carbon fit into the suite of other benefits, and then kind of flip the question the other way for Christine.
Yeah. So even though it's not usually how we fund projects, we have definitely funded them based on outcomes. Like in the lower Rio Grande Valley, we estimated the water outcomes using an NRCS report based on differing amounts of runoff from different types of land cover. And that was funded by the Coca-Cola Foundation. And so we have sold water credits, quote unquote. They weren't called that, but we do sometimes fund based on outcomes. And carbon, we're definitely working on that. There are some people, some other organizations that are funding work in the lower Rio Grande Valley, that same forest system, using carbon. So it's really based on what people are most interested in. If they are focused on that carbon element, we have ways of getting sort of not quite certified credits, nothing near the level of what Christine's describing, but sort of a middle ground. And that's something we're developing now. So.
Great, thanks. Christine, do you want to speak to that too, in the other way, with carbon first, but recognizing there's lots of values on those landscapes, and how does your program contextualize that?
Yeah, I think so certainly both AFF and TNC have a goal to contribute to climate mitigation, but we also have a number of other forest conservation goals. And so we do see this program as a way to bring additional revenue streams to landowners to accomplish these other benefits like wildlife habitat and water quality. So it's definitely a priority for our organizations to promote forest stewardship that has these other co-benefits associated with it. We haven't yet, through our program at least, gotten to the point of quantifying those, but we've certainly had interest from investors and buyers, and certainly from our own organizations, to kind of move in that direction and to provide that as an additional, I guess, additional benefit associated with the products that we're selling. The other thing, interestingly, that we've heard a lot recently from buyers in particular is a focus on the diversity and equity of the opportunity among the landowners themselves. So that's another avenue that we haven't really done a lot of work on, but it's a priority for us to think about how we can provide these opportunities and be more inclusive as a program as we release this program to more and more landowners.
That's great. Definitely important topics for climate change and all of us going forward. Well, so we are on the hour. This was really, really interesting. And we look forward to sharing the recording of this presentation so that it can be a reference going forward for those that enjoyed this today. And just want to thank everyone for joining that carved out some time this afternoon, and a really big thank you to our speakers. Christine, Austin, you both did a great job, and appreciate the time you put in preparing for the event and the time that you shared with us today. And thanks for all your good work. We'll be in touch soon, and thanks again, everybody.
Thank you.